Thank God it's Friday. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the program. I am Nifemi Oguntoye. President Tinubu yesterday met with China's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, at the State House, and is called on quite a number of things, one of which is asking China to expand the $2 billion currency swap agreement it has with Nigeria in order to boost bilateral trade and also appeal for an upward revision of the $50 billion aid package for Africa that was announced by the Chinese president last year. We're going to be talking a lot about that, the fact that the China foreign minister chooses to visit Africa first in its diplomatic missions, and that's a tradition they've kept for quite a number of years, over 30 years now. But we'll begin the conversation this morning by paying tribute to Jimmy Carter, the 39th U.S. president, whose state funeral held yesterday at the Washington National Cathedral, gathering political figures across board who turned out to celebrate a statesman whose impact resonated globally and who's now been remembered as the one who redefined U.S. post-presidency with his dedication to faith and public service. All 5 of his living presidential successors were in attendance, and the animated conversation that you just saw there between Donald Trump and Barack Obama has left many highly curious as to what exactly they were whispering about. At some point, Barack Obama was laughing to what Donald Trump was telling him. Jimmy Carter died at the age of 100 years old, making him the longest-lived president in U.S. history. The other U.S. president who lived that long was George H.W. Bush, who died in 2018, I think at the age of 94. So now Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, who were all present yesterday, can now dream to break that record. But according to a U.S. geriatrician, that's a doctor who attends to older adults, they say approximately 10% of people have the potential to reach the age of 100 in the U.S. So it is such a remarkable feat. And some scientists have said longevity like this stems from a complex interplay of genetics, lifestyle habits, environmental factors, and luck. Interestingly, Jimmy Carter was the first sitting U.S. president to visit Nigeria. He was hosted in 1978 by the then military head of state, Lieutenant General Olusegun Obasanjo in Lagos. Chief Obasanjo had visited him in Washington, D.C. 5 months earlier in a visit that was described as a diplomatic success at the time. So let's say perhaps he returned the favor. Joining me to have this conversation live from Geneva in Switzerland as former Nigerian Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Usman Sarki. Ambassador Sarki, thank you for joining us and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, Mr. Oguntoye. Good morning to you and to fellow Nigerians, and Happy New Year to you. Thank you for having me on your program today.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like us to start on a light note. They say only about 10% of people, I think in the U.S., have the potential to reach the age of 100. Are there lessons of longevity we can take from the School of Carter in this regard?
Yes, I think, devotion to God and humanitarian causes give certain satisfaction to the mind, the body, and the spirit. That makes the person endure tribulations and challenges and even diseases. And in that way, an active mind actually is a recipe for a strong body. And that was what Jimmy Carter represented. In 40 years or more after his presidency, he devoted his life and time and endeavors towards humanitarian efforts, towards peace and progress, economic development, democracy, and human rights. And in the process, he wrote, surprisingly, about 33 books. So that is quite a lot of achievement. And having a very prolific mind, it keeps the body healthy and remarkably active. And I think that is the secret of his longevity. And secondly, his spiritual beliefs. He was a Baptist Christian. Very devoted Christian, very devoted man of God, somebody who feared, the consequences of ill will and evil in the world. And that permeated his policy as a president and even afterwards when he left office. So these are things that we should look and learn. And don't forget that he went back to his farm when he left the presidency to farm and to be active. So he was mentally and physically, bodily, he was an active person until the last moment he left this earth.
Absolutely. He became more popular for his post-presidency activities that you highlighted, his humanitarian work, and also the fact that him and his wife founded Carter Center, where they promoted human rights and devoted their lives to easing suffering across the world. They dedicated that time to building, renovating, and repairing over 4,000 homes across 14 countries in their lifetime. Let's talk about his relationship with Rosalind, his wife. They shared 77 years of marriage. They say it's the longest in presidential history. Is that some sort of a secret? If you agree to it, good marital life perhaps can extend your life?
Yes, certainly. I think, happiness at home is the beginning of a healthy life. And his marriage with Rosalind, which actually represented the rural background, was the beginning of the confidence that he had as a politician, really, to run for, Georgia House of Assembly or the Congress, and then to governor, and then actually to run for president. That relationship actually, presented him the pedestal, the pillar or the foundation, if you like, to look outside the family, outside his community, outside his state and the southern part of the U.S., to say that, look, the spiritual values that I imbibed as a Baptist Christian, and also my family life as a rural person, I can project those values onto the national and global stage to bring harmony, peace, and happiness to people. And I think that marriage and the fact that he had those lovely children, and we saw his grandson yesterday delivering the eulogy, in honor of his grandfather. So those family ties were the embodiment of the linkages that he had with his people, with his community, with his country, and with the larger world. And that was why he became so sympathetic to the causes of people in Africa, in Palestine, in other parts of the world, to highlight the sufferings and challenges of people. When a person suffers, it is a family that suffers. And I think that was the background that informed his humanitarian activities.
Absolutely. So he survived by 5 living successors, former U.S. presidents, including Joe Biden, all of which we saw at the funeral yesterday. It's a tricky guess, Ambassador. Do you think we will see any of them break that 100-year record in our lifetime?
Well, Joe Biden is on the way.
No, absolutely.
Hopefully, if he remains healthy and active. And Barack Obama, he's very physically fit, spiritually, also somebody who is focused in terms of family values and so forth, and intellectually also very sharp, and active. So these two, I think, and Clinton too, remember, he is also now in the old age bracket, and Donald Trump also. The American system caters for their presidents and absolutely the highest degree of health care and well-being. So I think we will expect all 5 of them to, by the grace of God, to be around for some more years.
Let's talk about his relationship with Africa. He was the first U.S. president to make a state visit to Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa. At that time, he declared that the day of the so-called ugly American is over, acknowledging that America perhaps had neglected Africa for so long. He visited Nigeria in 1978. There were conversations as regards strengthening the U.S. relations with African nations. The conversations at the time, were around African liberation movements, promoting U.S. interest on the continent, and what have you. But how would you say Jimmy Carter's presidency impacted on Nigeria-U.S. relations as we know it today?
Well, I think, he came into office in 1978, but let us go a little way back to 1975, during the Gerald Ford administration in America. And that was the height of the anti-colonial struggle in Angola, in Mozambique, and also in Namibia, and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa when it's beginning to gain momentum. Gerald Ford sent emissaries to African presidents, and very imperiously, peremptorily, almost like a dictation, to tell them to support the Western-backed movements, like anti-colonial movements in Angola, led by Jonas Savimbi, and not the MPLA, led by Agostinho Neto. Now, Murtala Mohammed at that time, General Murtala Mohammed, was the head of state, and he refused to really go by what the Americans wanted him to do. And you remember he went to Addis Ababa at the OAU heads of state and government meeting and declared famously that Africa's fortunes were for Africans to make or to mar.
Indeed.
That position defined very critically the position of Nigeria towards the liberation struggle in Africa. But that was even before, that was after actually, Sawabukar Tafawa established the foundation for the anti-colonial, non-aligned position in terms of our foreign policy. So there is a continuum of foreign policy doctrine in Nigeria from the 60s to the 70s up to the point when President Olusegun Obasanjo took power.
Okay.
Now, Jimmy Carter, coming from the Georgia background, knowing the damages and the moral consequences of slavery and also racial discrimination in America, he came with the belief that all human beings are equal. They were born equal, and racial discrimination, racism, was an evil. And on that basis, I think he saw Africa in a different light from the other presidents that came before him. And that is why he declared that America had neglected Africa for too long. And he declared that supporting the independence of Zimbabwe from white-dominated colonial rule was the most significant thing that America had done. And these are really things that Africans should not forget. They are very, very momentous, very historic, and very revolutionary.
Indeed.
When we look at the context of the United States of American politics at that time, during the Cold War era.
And I'm glad that we have you this morning to have that conversation, because I understand that you were critical to the formulation of our foreign policy itself, years back. Jimmy Carter's visit was quite brief, but it's said to have a lasting impact on our relations with America. The emphasis at the time was on liberation, as you've mentioned, the struggles for majority rule in countries like Rhodesia, that's now Zimbabwe and South Africa. But how do you see, how have the interests evolved over the years from what U.S. interest was, those years?
Yes, in those years, in the 70s, remember, that the Cold War was raging, really. And the arms reduction talks and other things were taking place to douse tension and to reduce the threat or the accidents of nuclear war. And Africa was central to the Cold War to win hearts and minds of Africans. Liberation struggles were beginning to really gain momentum. Armed struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia was beginning to organize under SWAPO, and ANC too was actually beginning to engage in armed struggle from the neighboring countries. So the situation in Africa was very critical at that time. And the Cold War mentality of the American establishment refused to see the positive aspects of liberation of Africa. And in fact, it insisted on retaining the privileges of the white minority regimes in all these countries for the economic benefit. But President Carter agreed with African heads of state and government that the situation would no longer be tenable in terms of having a minority white racist governments in power in Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, and South Africa. And he aligned himself with the aspirations of Africa, drawing from the spiritual background that he was brought up in Georgia, where discrimination against black people was rampant, which he repudiated in his lifetime by really appointing people like Andrew Yang and recognizing the civil rights movement and empowering black people in the United States of America. So his presidency was a decisive moment in terms of the liberation of Africa and the reshaping of the global policy towards the continent. Unhappily today, we are back to a situation whereby the Cold War mentality of maximizing of positions and of advantages in Africa is beginning to resurface, especially vis-a-vis relationship between the Western countries and China and Russia. And the scramble, the second so-called scramble, for African resources, and as we are seeing playing out today.
Absolutely. We're going to touch on that when we turn our attention to our relations with China that appears to have flourished tremendously over the years. But the former U.S. president was known for his emphasis on human rights and democracy. Do you think his administration's policies in any way influenced Nigeria's transition to democracy?
Yes, I think it did, because you see, national affairs are invariably impacted upon by global affairs. And there was a trend now in the 70s towards actually, the democratization of the world in terms of spreading the values of democracy and human rights. And the American establishment at that time went about doing that from the Cold War prism, the Cold War mentality. But when President Jimmy Carter came into office, he looked at Africa and said, we can relate with these people, this continent, on the basis of equality, on the basis of empathy, on the basis of understanding, not from the point of view of condescension. And that really endeared him personally to African leaders, and it allowed Africans to receive his message with open mind, open heart, and also to know or to realize that democracy was a virtuous principle if it can be applied in our continent. And the wind of change continued even after he left office, when he dedicated his time not only to humanitarian causes, but also to the fact of promoting human rights, human dignity, and democracy in our continent and other places. And remember, he actually participated more in peace processes in countries like South Sudan, in Bosnia, in Cuba, in Haiti, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, and other places, and even in Namibia, towards really bringing about reconciliation, ending of armed combat and conflicts and so forth. So his legacy in Africa is very tremendous. And I think let us recall that there was a book written by Nancy Mitchell titled Carter in Africa. And I think it's very important that we should get hold of this book to read, to see what this man of God, this amiable gentleman had done for Africa.
He also broke out the historic Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. And I'm wondering, as a seasoned diplomat yourself, what lessons you think we can learn from his diplomatic approach, especially as it concerns his emphasis on human rights and conflict resolution?
In diplomacy, I think it's very important to have a neutral position if you want to broker a deal or peace between two conflicting parties. Today, or the last 30 years, for instance, we could not get traction or momentum towards the resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict because of the lack of neutrality on the part of America and the Western world. They solidly affirmed their support for Israel, right or wrong, and today we have seen the devastation that has been meted on the people of Gaza by America standing firmly with Israel. If we have had a position whereby the American president will say, look, I'm on the side of peace, I'm on the side of humanity. I'm on the side of human rights. I'm on the side of self-determination. Come, let us sit down and talk. I will be an impartial broker. I think the Oslo Agreement would have been implemented. And by now, this bloodshed, this conflict, this terrible disaster unfolding before our very eyes would not have taken place. Jimmy Carter approached Egypt and Israel and told them, you are neighbors. You are tied by the umbilical cord of history and geography. No matter how much you fight, no matter for how long you fight, one day you have to seek reconciliation because of the fact of history and geography. And I think that made it possible for Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister at that time, Menachem Begin, I think, to sit down to say, look, yes, we can agree. Let us have peace between us. And that was what happened. So today, Mr. Gunte, the world needs statesmen, not politicians. I'm sad to say. We don't have statesmen today. What we have are politicians who are interested in what the headlines of the television, CNN or BBC or Washington Post and New York Times will say tomorrow. That is the short-sighted nature of politics today. Statesmen look at history beyond their point of departure from the world. What will the world say after I have left? And I think Jimmy Carter was one of such rare gems of people who looked beyond tomorrow's headline to actually think about what the world will say about him after he leaves the world. And that is the legacy today we are discussing, of being a statesman.
Indeed.
And a really consummate diplomat to bring about reconciliation between two unlikely foes.
Indeed.
That he brokered and brought about peace that has endured, surprisingly, up till this moment between Egypt and Israel.
Ambassador, I think we all agree that Jimmy Carter's legacy continues to shape Nigeria-U.S. relations today. You have also highlighted the opportunities it presented. But what do you consider the challenges that arise from this legacy?
Well, the challenges that arise are those of ideology. The American establishment today is steeped in ideology of liberalism. And by ideology of liberalism, I mean the ideology that drives tendencies like the LGBT phenomena, and insisting that Africa must liberalize the human rights space, the political space, the civil society space, for us to accommodate aberrant behaviors that are not in tandem with our cultural customs and religious beliefs. They are insisting that we must make abortion, for instance, available across the board for every woman who wants to do it, regardless of the circumstances or situation. They are telling us that we should teach sexual orientation and other practices in our school, even from kindergarten to primary and upwards to other levels of education. These ideological tendencies are marring the relationship between Africa and the U.S. And on the other hand, looking at the economic relationship between Africa and the Western world, particularly the United States, there is really very little to write home about in terms of concrete, substantial, demonstrable evidence of the facilitation of the economic development of Africa. Yes, there is investment here and there in areas like supporting private sector and so forth. But when it comes to the critical question of infrastructure development, industrialization, and opening up of markets for African products, you find reluctance and conflicting attitudes from one administration to the other. And I think, when President Donald Trump comes into office in a few weeks' time, we may see a seesaw sort of change of behavior toward Africa that may not be conducive to a sustenance of relationship in a positive manner between us and the United States of America. But Jimmy Carter, he learned about the situation in Africa by reading, by informing himself of Africa, by bringing scholars around him to inform him about the situation in Africa, and they allowed him to make up his mind independently from the information that he gathered. And economic development, hand in hand with liberation and democratization and human rights, were the priorities that he pursued in Africa. Yes. And when he left, the Guinea Worm Crusade, or the anti-Guinea Worm Crusade, became a hallmark of his life and efforts after leaving office.
Interestingly, he was one of the first people to give early support to pro-gay legislation and embrace LGBT advocates. In fact, they say he moved
but he never pushed it down the throat of other countries.
Like
Obama and Clinton and Hillary
attempted to, exactly.
By currently Joe Biden tried to do in Ghana, in Uganda, in Nigeria, in other countries of Africa. So I think that is a dividing line ideologically between America and Africa. We may be pro-human rights, that is all right, but human rights is actually not something alien to Africa. At least as far as we are concerned, we have had our regimes of human rights a long time before even we came in contact with the Western world. And the continuation of those practices may not be Western or modern, some of our practices, but they are not actually fundamental, antithetical to the enjoyment of human rights. So by bringing those doctrines onto us, they seem to really create certain challenges in the running of smooth relationship between, or the smooth running of relationship between us and the United States of America.
Let's take a short break, Ambassador. When we return, we'll turn our attention to Nigeria's relations with China. China's foreign minister met with President Tinubu yesterday, and it's in continuation of a tradition we've seen over 30 years of visiting Africa first in their diplomatic travels in the year. Stay with us, everyone. Don't go away.
Information is power, information is security, information is knowledge on label.
Thank you for staying with us, everyone. Let's dive now into the significance of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to 4 African nations, including Nigeria. He met with President Tinubu yesterday. Staying with me, we began this conversation some 30 minutes earlier. Former Nigerian Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Sarki. Thank you so much for staying the course on the program. So Wang Yi's visit, we understand, marks the 35th consecutive year that the Chinese foreign minister has chosen Africa as a first port of call in the year when it comes to diplomatic relations. Talk to us about what this says about China's strategic priorities and how Africa fits into its global agenda.
Well, thank you very much for really visiting this very topical issue. After all, it was only yesterday, less than 24 hours ago, when the Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with His Excellency President Bola Tinubu and with the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Yusuf Tuggar. So it is very topical, very important for us to recall the relationship between China and Nigeria, in particular, and Africa in general. But before doing so, I think Nigerians would maybe should know why China made it a point of duty in the last 35 years or so to entrust the visit of the foreign ministers to Africa as the first port of call, and it has become a ritual now. Now, in 1989, the Tiananmen incident took place, whereby young people, students, protested against the government. And the government of the day, I think under Premier Le Pen, did not accommodate those so-called fresh spring, that the students wanted to bring into China, governance and politics. And so the protest was ended in unhappy circumstances. Because of the nature and the way the process was suppressed, the Western governments used that as an excuse to isolate China. And they prevailed on many countries, especially in the Western ideological camp, to really refrain from having meaningful contacts and relationships with China, such as visits. But African countries, they saw the reality behind that was an internal affairs of China. Why should we not have relationship with a country like China? African foreign ministers, African diplomats visited Beijing, and the Chinese felt obliged to really reciprocate that gesture by reposing more confidence and trust in Africa. And one decision that came at the highest level of the Communist Party was that each year from 1990 or 1991 thereabout, the first trip the Chinese foreign minister should make to any part of the world should be to Africa, to show our solidarity, to return this confidence and gesture that they showed us. And it was in that spirit that every year, in the first or second week of January, Chinese foreign ministers ritually came to Africa to visit 3 or 4 countries, different parts of the continent. So this is just by way of history.
Indeed.
But going back further, China's ties with Africa, modern communist China's ties with Africa, went back to 1963-64, when Zhou Enlai, that illustrious prime minister of that country, visited East Africa, North Africa, and West Africa, and visited Ghana in 1963 and 1964. And over and above that, in 1955, the Bandung Conference, held in Indonesia, established the political framework for liberation of Africa and the rest of the world, Asia, and the political engagement of the so-called southern countries and the birth of the non-aligned movement and so forth. So it was in those spirits and traditions that these visits are taking place regularly. Mr. Ogunti.
Absolutely. China, no doubt, has been investing heavily in Africa's infrastructure development. We've seen significant cooperation in areas like trade, technology, and energy. And we've also seen what has been termed the potential benefits all around. But I'd like us to talk about the drawbacks of these partnerships for African nations. Which stands out for you?
Well, if there are any drawbacks, they must emanate from the inadequacies of our own internal policies and programs, the way we manage projects, the way we manage loans and grants and other things. Let us remember that between the last 40 years or so, China was heavily reliant on imported capital, loans and investments from the West, particularly from countries like Germany, France, Austria, the United States, and UK. And that was how they developed their economy to be the second largest economy today, by actually importing capital from outside and also from the Chinese diaspora. Now, in our own case in Africa, whenever capital is imported into the country or into any country, the operation of that capital is rather opaque and also indeterminate in terms of its flow into critical sectors, whereby projects can be started and completed on time and delivered to the society of the country. So the fault, if any, should not be placed at the doorstep of the Chinese, but actually the way we manage those opportunities that are given to us by the Chinese in terms of loans and grants. So if you look at the relationship with China today, in the last 20 years or so, they have become the biggest trading partner of sub-Saharan Africa. And also, they are the biggest source of investment, particularly in capital projects, railways, ports, airports, construction of roads, cities, and so forth. So we should look at the advantages of those programs rather than focusing on ideologically driven opposition of those support that China has been given to Africa, which are largely being manufactured in the West and re-echoed in certain African circles. It's not very healthy, but it is a fact of life that everything has an opposition to it. But what matters is how do we manage those resources that are being pumped into our countries by China. But I'm happy that yesterday His Excellency President Bola Tinubu indicated that more needs to be done by China in terms of investment in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, by expanding two facilities. Number one, the FOCAC, China-Africa Summit meeting that took place in Beijing, whereby $50 billion was pledged to support Africa. He called for expansion of that fund, which is very logical because the previous commitment made in Johannesburg by the same Chinese president was 60 billion. So it was scaled down to 50 billion in the Beijing conference. Now our president is saying, please scale that up. You can do it. The second one is the really increase in the yuan component of the foreign currency, of the currency swap of 2 billion yuan between Nigeria and China to enable the facilitation of trade. So our president has seen merit in Chinese investment, in Chinese capital in Africa, in Nigeria. And I think we should also do the same by welcoming the commitment to Nigeria in terms of building our railways, our ports, our rails, and other things, and not to raise suspicions where they should not actually be raised at all in the first place.
The suspicions usually are rooted in concerns as regards the broader context of the new scramble for Africa that you mentioned earlier, with multiple global powers, including the US and Russia and other countries in Europe now vying for influence and resources on the continent. How should Africa be wary of potential new colonialism and ensure that its interests are adequately protected in this era of power competition?
Well, I think, our own disposition matters greatly. I can speak only in respect of Nigeria, but we can make references to other countries. In Nigeria, strengthening of our laws in terms of extraction of minerals, for instance, and the diligent application of those laws will mitigate any negative impact that Chinese presence or foreign presence, for that matter, might have. The strengthening of institutions and control of the regime of extraction of minerals is very critical. We have seen how Barrick Gold and I think, the government of Guinea or Mali are having some conflicts in terms of the share of the resources. One of the Australian companies, I think, is a Canadian company, is having 80% of the stake in the gold mine in that country. And the country is only having 20%. And the government now is saying, no, that is not good enough. We want more of the percentage of the resources that you are extracting. So I think a look at our enabling legislation can help us to really focus on adopting measures to mitigate any negative fallouts of the presence of foreign actors on our continent. But I think this suspicion, Mr. Oguntoye, that you are referring to, is largely driven by Western perception of neocolonialism and other things. They have no excuse, really, to tell us this, because in the last 60 years, they could not rise up to the task to invest substantially in building infrastructure in Africa. I will ask you one question. Can you tell me one railway line from one city to another in any country that was constructed by direct aid from any Western country? I don't know if they exist. Today, it's only now that the so-called this railway line from Angola to DRC is being contemplated by the United States of America. in return or in response to the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government, whereby they have been building ports, railways, and other things. If you go to East Africa today, to Kenya, to Tanzania, to Ethiopia, the dynamics of economic development has been fundamentally altered by Chinese presence in those countries in terms of construction of railways, construction of seaports, construction of roads and highways, construction of industrial zones, construction of manufacturing facilities, construction of factories, establishment of agricultural research institutions and development facilities. These are game-changing innovations and changes brought about by Chinese presence in Africa. We haven't seen those things done by any Western countries.
Indeed.
Rather, they prefer to establish military bases in Africa. Can you tell me anywhere where the Chinese have established a military presence to prioritize military occupation of any part of Africa? They may have an agreement with Djibouti in terms of coastal activities whereby the ships can come and go. I don't know of any other physical Chinese military presence in Africa apart from the peacekeeping endeavor that they are engaged in under auspices of the United Nations.
So I get your point, Ambassador, and one would think that the West should carry some moral burden considering the colonial role they played, in setting Africa back based on those experiences. But I also
the moral burden, Mr. Wunti, they will continue to bear the moral burden until the end of time. It's not something that is going to end. So long as we Africans exist in this world and generations of Africans exist, that moral burden will be with the West. For 400 years of slave trade, for over 100 years of colonialism, for 400 years of colonialism in South Africa, and also other atrocities committed against our people. Let Nigerians, I'm happy that the Minister of Education and the government is speaking about the introduction of history in our schools. Let us go and read the history of colonialism in Africa today. It is not a happy incident. It is what has brought us to this situation today of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia against black people, of underdevelopment, of backwardness, of instability. Everything you can think of has a historical factor behind it. And these are the things that we have been battling with since independence for the last 6 years. I am not excusing our own inadequacies in terms of missed opportunities, muddled policies and corruption and other things.
And leadership as well.
At the same time, the issue of history, which is like a millstone around our necks, cannot be disposed of. But I'm happy that we are realizing these things and making some changes. So I do hope that under the current dispensation in our country, pragmatic policies will be taken whereby the development of infrastructure can be the main priority of government and also to assist industrialization. I recall the interviews given by President Tinubu before he became president, his speeches, on how particular emphasis he placed on industrialization. I really sincerely hope that his mind will not be detracted from the focus of industrializing Nigeria by really building infrastructure, building our power generation and distribution capacity, and also creating the enabling environment for injection of capital from countries like China to develop our industries.
Absolutely. Ambassador, we're wrapping up now, but I'll also love us to quickly explore the geopolitical implications of China's growing presence in Africa. How do you think other global powers like the US and Europe view its increasing influence on the continent? This visit, for instance, is coming just before Trump's inauguration, and we understand the sentiment that he has for China.
Well, I think, the perception of other countries about China's presence in Africa is of no consequence to us. It is of no utility. It is of no significance whatsoever. We cannot belittle ourselves to think of what others think before we act. We are independent continents. made up of 53 independent countries with our own foreign policy priorities and national interests. If engaging in China is a core national interest position, nothing should detract us from really adopting that position. After all, have we told America or the Western countries not to join NATO, for instance? Have we told them that they should reduce their rhetoric against Russia and China? Have we told them to really join our perception of really enabling the independence of Palestine and others? No, we do not interfere in their own position. So let them not dictate to us how we should perceive our friends, or who should be our friend or who should not be our friend. So global geopolitics is nothing but really position our countries to extract maximum benefits from the economic dynamics in terms of their relationship with other countries, particularly Africa.
Former Nigerian Deputy Permanent Representative of the United Nations, Ambassador Usman Sarki, who joins us live from Geneva. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
Thank you for having me, Ogunchi. Thank you. Have a very good day.
You too. And that's our show today. Thanks for being a part of it. We're back at the top of the hour with the news. Stay with us.
Following is a paid presentation by ShopX TV. It's ShopX Bonanza time. ShopX TV is thrilled to offer an exclusive